If you've been online much recently, you've probably already seen this clip.
This was a fucking mess. I am saying this because, and I have this policy, right? If it's the first game in a new series, if it's the second, third, I can be more forgiving of things finding its footing. This is chapter fucking 5.
In this now infamous crash out, Markiplier expresses his frustrations with the newest chapter of Poppy Playtime. Now, the Poppy Playtime games have been really popular online for a long time now, at least relatively speaking, especially in the Let's Player circuit. While I was never really interested in these games myself, I thought it was in pretty good standing among its fans. Markiplier's crash out seems to have been a bit of a watershed moment for that community. I have seen a ton of people reacting to the clip from Markiplier's stream and basically agreeing with everything he says. However, there's also a huge group of people online giving Markiplier a lot of crap for his takes and saying that the game is actually really good. Or at least parts of the game are. As an outsider looking in, I found this entire thing kind of intriguing. As far as I could tell, Poppy Playtime was just a typical mascot horror game with all of the trappings of the genre. Why was it suddenly so hated? What went wrong here? As I got deeper and deeper into this drama, I only got more and more interested into what exactly was happening. To me, Poppy Playtime feels like a microcosm of a much bigger issue. The mascot horror genre, though I do technically disagree with it being a genre as opposed to a group of survival horror games with a similar set of themes and aesthetics. Anyway, these games seem to have a bit of a problem. I feel like the community surrounding these games has been taught to engage with this material in a way that is destructive to their ability to analyze media, and that leads to, well, more bad games. Combine this with the fact that Poppy Playtime is just a complete mess of a video game, and you get this situation. There's a lot of ground to cover, and as an outsider looking in, I do have to say that my opinions are a bit more speculative. All I can really accomplish is tossing my voice out into the void and hoping that somebody else can pick it apart and see where I've actually hit the mark and where I'm just misunderstanding the situation. Anyway, this intro is already long enough, let's go ahead and get started. Now, before I can discuss in depth the audience's reaction to these games, I want to talk briefly about my opinions on the games themselves. Surely this won't take that long. For reference, here's my experience with Poppy Playtime. I did not play a single bit of this game or watch any Let's Plays past Chapter 1 until this drama happened. Once I got more interested in making a video about the topic, I decided that it wouldn't be fair for me to come to any conclusions about the games without at least giving them a shot first. So I went ahead and played through the first 3 chapters all on my own and then watched Dako's Let's Plays of Chapter 4 and 5. No, I'm not spending another $35 and another whole day of my life to play the last 2 chapters, especially after I didn't enjoy playing the first 3. Also, my game kind of soft-locked in Chapter 3, I really don't know what's happening here. So, yes, my experience is somewhat limited here, but I still think I can come to some solid conclusions about the game. In my opinion, Poppy Playtime is a game that is constantly on the cusp of greatness. It's so close to being a good horror game, to being a good story. It has the ideas and a lot of the fundamental building blocks, but it has just never put them together in a coherent way. Outside of just a few segments in Chapter 1 and 3, the game was never scary. And I don't mean it wasn't scary, I didn't jump at the jump scares. It wasn't even able to build that sense of tension that a horror game relies on for most of its runtime. Chapter 2 was a complete failure on this front, and I think this is the best example of one of my biggest issues with Poppy Playtime as a game. All of your time playing this game can be split into 2 distinct categories. Times when you are not in any danger whatsoever, and times when the game is actively trying to kill you. This is actually a massive problem, because as soon as you get wise to how the game is divided up, any sense of tension at any point is completely destroyed. Chapter 2 is the best example of this. Pretty quickly, you see how the chapter is going to be structured. You have to play 3 games with Mommy Longlegs, where the punishment for failure is death. Outside of that, you're going to be solving puzzles to get from place to place. And in those segments of the game, there is literally nothing bad that can happen to you. Besides being forced to solve Poppy Playtime puzzles, I mean. This means that for most of the runtime of the game, you're completely checked out of the experience, tension-wise. You have no reason to be scared of anything because you know that nothing can hurt you. But then when you do get to the minigames, you know that you're about to be jump scared if you mess up. So you're ready for it to happen, which completely ruins the point of a jump scare. Not to mention that if, like me, you're bad at video games, you're probably going to have to play through these sections more than once, especially since the game is not always super clear about what you're supposed to do. There is nothing that kills tension in a horror game more than repetition, than being able to look at something and say, oh, I remember what I'm supposed to do here.
I do not like my gameplay to be trial and error. And in a chase sequence, as I've said before in these games, as soon as you die, it loses all of its value!
By the time you have to play these minigames more than once, you're already out of the experience. The only one of these that I didn't get bored by was the first one. I basically first tried it because it was pretty easy, and then having to react to the final bit where it becomes impossible and you have to hit the cancel button was actually pretty tense. It's not even that these horror segments of the game are bad, it's just that relying on them to scare the player alone leaves the entire rest of the game feeling empty. I think now is a good time to talk about the mechanics of the game, or rather, the game's seeming refusal to have any mechanics. One thing that really stuck out to me in the later chapters is that the characters all make such a big deal out of us, saying that we killed all these huge enemies that they've had such a hard time dealing with for so long.
You're the one they've been talking about! The one who put Mommy in the grinder? Who gave the cat a nap? Down here, they're calling you the Playtime Butcher.
God, what a terrible name. Anyway, this really stuck with me because we don't really, do anything in this game. The extent of our interactions with the actual main villains of each chapter are literally just running away and, pulling a lever or pulling a box off of a high place or something. Do you really expect me to believe that no one else could do that? It seriously starts to strain credulity, especially in the fight with the prototype. There's just a whole rack of exploding barrels ready for us to drop them on him, and a giant Tesla coil that perfectly shoots him, and he just happens to land exactly on the freezable goop next to the freeze panel, and at some point, this all just starts to feel really silly and honestly predictable. But it's also necessary because the game refuses to give the player any means of defending themselves, besides the flare gun, which only works on the smiling critters. And at first, this sounds like a really intuitive idea. Games are usually power fantasies where the player can run through tons of enemies with ease. Horror games have traditionally flipped this dynamic on its head by making the player weaker, making them die more easily, and making the resources they use to survive those encounters scarce. Why not take this up to 11 and make the player basically defenseless? As intuitive as that choice sounds, it's actually a terrible idea. Mostly because it changes the way you have to design literally everything in the game in a way that becomes too restrictive. In certain horror games like Alien Isolation or Five Nights at Freddy's, you are in danger the moment the games begin. You are constantly being hunted by monsters, and you have no conventional form of protecting yourself. However, the player always does have a mean to hide or defend themselves through some other means. Most of the time, if you die in one of these games, it is your fault. This means that the threats in these games can be active basically constantly, and it's fine because the player can survive that. And since the threats are always active, the player must always be ready to respond to them. But in Poppy Playtime, if you were to be put in a room with Cat Scratch and he wanted to kill you, no ifs, ands, or buts, you just die. The only ways you have to defend yourself are environmental. I guess that also applies in FNAF, but those games take place in like a single location, literally one room. So that is never an issue. But in Poppy Playtime, since you're so defenseless, you have to constantly be separated from anything that can kill you by the level design. You must always be given an out, and this severely limits how these threats can be deployed. Since the threats to the player can't be around for most of the game, we end up with the clear delineation of threats that I described earlier. Places where you are completely safe, and places where you are in constant danger. Most horror games escalate tension by blending these two states. There are places of safety, places of mild danger, of high danger, places where you are literally about to die, holy crap, run. Part of what allows these games to be so tense is that the player doesn't know how much danger they're in at any given moment. Let's take a closer look at how Five Nights at Freddy's works as an example. In FNAF, there are moments of extreme danger when the animatronics are about to jump scare you, but the player has to expend a resource to figure out what threats are around them and then act appropriately. The question you are constantly asking yourself in FNAF is, how much danger am I in? The key to fear is uncertainty, of not knowing what's coming next, and thinking that what's about to happen could be horrible. Poppy Playtime barely has this, because it is extremely predictable, and it has to be because it can't afford to put the player in dangerous scenarios, because the player has no means of defending themselves. You see how this one seemingly intuitive design decision has had tons of knock-on effects on the entire rest of the game? It gets even worse though. The fact that the player can only interact with their environment in incredibly stilted and narrow ways forces the design of the game to bend over backwards at every turn. Of course, there can't be any actual danger in the in-between segments for the most part, because that would make solving all the puzzles a huge chore, since the player can't do anything but run and hide from enemies. Of course, the player has to kill bad guys in incredibly contrived setups where the monsters, who know this facility far better than we do, chase us into an area where we can conveniently dispatch them because we have no other means of fighting. Of course, the game is chock full of god-awful puzzles to pad runtime because there is literally no other way that the player can interact with this game. The mere existence of the puzzles isn't an issue. In fact, they actually serve a vital purpose in the game. Horror is made by constantly building and releasing tension. You have to start low, build tension up by making the player think they're in danger, and then release that tension with a big scary thing happening, and then let the player cool off for a second before building that tension back up. The puzzles give the player time to cool off in between the big horror segments. They let the atmosphere and the world of the game sink in for a moment. And if that was all they were, that'd be completely fine. The real problem is that the game has nothing else it can use to make the player feel like they're accomplishing something. The only tools in its utility belt are puzzles, massive custom crafted chase sequences, or mini games. I remember this particular part of Mark's rant.
I don't know if the developers of this game think it's just their thing. We're the chase sequence game. We're the game of chase sequences. We are the chase sequence game. That was in the first one and people loved it. And then the second one, remember when Mommy Longlegs was chasing you? Oh, it was fucking nuts. Remember the third one when we put more chase sequences in? Remember the fourth one, the chase sequences. Maybe we'll tone down a little bit for the fifth one. Chase, 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 chase.
For a while, I wondered why exactly the devs kept throwing in chase sequences like this. Was it like Mark said, because they thought that they were the chase sequence game? But, after playing a couple of chapters, I realized that wasn't what was happening. What was actually happening was that they were doing that because it was the only thing that the devs could do. They're between a rock and a hard place. And it's so frustrating because they literally built a solution in Chapter 3. Chapter 3 introduces the flare gun and the smiling critters, in a section where you have to solve a little puzzle in the dark while these guys slowly creep after you. You can use the flare gun to scare them away, but there are always more coming after you and you have to wait to reload, so you have to be careful with your ammo. Not to mention that the flares make it a lot easier to see what you're actually doing in the dark, making using them to light the area extremely tempting, but that also puts stress on your ammo consumption. This was like the only moment in Chapter 3 where I actually felt tense, like how a horror game should make you feel. Because it was the only moment where you're under a threat, but you aren't expecting to get jump scared. Unlike everything else that had happened in the game, it wasn't super telegraphed, it wasn't frustratingly difficult, and it wasn't trial and error to figure out how to get past it. I died like once or twice here, but that was because I messed up. And also because I tried to grab the block from the lower level instead of the higher level, and it got all messed up and I got stuck for a bit. Anyway, the point is that when this happened, I was so excited because the game finally felt like a game. It was no longer a shitty walking simulator and puzzle game with occasional horror segments. It was a horror game where you have to explore a big scary place while under constant threat, and it's gone. Yeah, you use this mechanic for like one segment and never again. The flares don't even do anything to Catnap or any of the other villains. Poppy Playtime. What the hell? I really don't understand why you would spend so much time making a mechanic and just not utilize it. I really don't understand why the smiling critters weren't a constant threat after this point in the game. They literally had a solution right in front of them and they just didn't use it. I think the issue here is just the approach that the devs have to game design. Poppy's Playtime doesn't seem to be developed as like a game. Video games have interlocking systems that slowly build on each other. In games, when you get an upgrade, you go, wow, I can't wait to see what I can do with this, because those upgrades make previously dangerous enemies easier to deal with. They may open access to new areas. They change the way the player approaches the game. In Poppy Playtime, every single scene is crafted in isolation of the rest of the game, mechanically speaking. I guess there's some overlap between learning how the hands work and using them in chases, but most of the ideas that are used in puzzles aren't used again in the chase sequences because they take too long to do. Each of the minigames is a one-and-done idea, and many of the hands seem to have been designed for their own isolated puzzle segments and for a few key moments here and there. They never cross over with each other. This is really apparent in how I saw Chapter 4 and 5 playing out. In those games, the flare gun is only used to burn a few doors open and to explode these canisters during the doughy fight. It's never used to scare any monsters away like it used to. Then in Chapter 5, you lose all of your hands and have to get a bunch of new ones that are made for their own puzzles and chase sequences, completely unrelated to any of the previous hands. The game makes such a big deal out of the hands. Giblet describes you as getting equipped with a grab pack and talks about how they'll help protect you from monsters, but the longer the game goes on, the more they feel like a contrivance and a way to bloat runtime more than anything. You can't use them to interact with anything, and you can't defend yourself meaningfully with them. All you can do is use them in the Poppy Playtime approved puzzle segments and the Poppy Playtime approved chase sequences in exactly the way the devs want you to. And like, sure, that's sort of how most game mechanics work, but most games hide it a lot better. When you jump on a new enemy in a Mario game, it feels natural because it's an extension of how you've already learned to interact with everything else in that game. When you have to shoot an enemy a different way in an FPS like Ultra Kill, it makes sense because it's a natural extension of the previous shooting things you've already been doing. Whenever you start a new chase sequence in Poppy Playtime, you're constantly asking yourself, what do the devs want me to do here? Because every chase is so contrived and forced, you know that you're not interacting with the game world, you're following the game's script. I don't want to do the tacky thing of suggesting fixes to the game because I'm not a game designer and God knows I couldn't do any better. But I can tell you how the game made me feel when I played it. The game tried to make me scared and excited, and sometimes, very briefly, it did do that. But far more often, the game made me bored or frustrated or just completely apathetic to the experience. I think the game was built off of a few clever ideas that were all applied in the wrong way. And from that broken foundation, so many of the issues in the game that people have complained about become sort of inevitable. So yeah, ultimately I think the gameplay of Poppy Playtime is close to being good, and there are segments that I did enjoy, but it just misses the mark so hard that I can't remain interested. And the thing is, I don't think that all the things I've said here are that controversial. I expect that people will say that the horror scenes are better than I say they are, but most people agree that the stuff in between those segments is pretty weak. If so many people have such a big problem with this game, what is it that's keeping it going? What is it that's got so many people so invested in this franchise? Well, that's actually a pretty simple question to answer. Something you'll hear a lot in the Poppy Playtime community is that the story of the games is really good. Someone made an entire video with the thesis that the gameplay is holding the story back, and I've seen many people say that the game should just be a movie or something.
I'll say this. I think I've said it multiple times about Poppy Playtime. The worst part about Poppy Playtime is the gameplay, by far. Like, by far, that is the worst part about Poppy Playtime is the gameplay.
I think that there was like emotional core here that was trying to shine through, and it's like I wanted to be in it, but by the time I got there, I didn't care.
Dude,
I just didn't care.
Exactly. That's the point that I made at the end of the game. Dude, the endless puzzles and chases suck so much life out of you that by the time you're at the end of the game, you forgot what happened at the start of the game. Once you sit on one electricity pylon puzzle for 45 minutes, you forgot what happened before you got there. The whole, you know, like I said, I love Poppy Playtime, right? But it would be better as a movie. The lore and the characters and everything in Poppy Playtime is the most goated thing literally ever. But the gameplay is quite literally just filler until the next cutscene or the next, like, monster shows up.
This is fascinating to me because I thought the story of Poppy Playtime was awful. Before I can explain my issues with the story of the game, I think I need to paint a bit of a picture. I need you to understand how the audience for this game understands its story, how they interact with and analyze that story. But to understand that, we need to go back to the beginning. We have to go back to where this all began. We need to talk about Five Nights at Freddy's again. FNAF is the grandfather of the mascot horror genre. Much of this movement is predicated on people trying to recreate its success, to recapture the lightning in a bottle that Scott Cawthon stumbled upon with the first FNAF game. It was a cultural moment that cannot be understated or repeated. And if you're still watching this video, you probably already have a good idea why. The game was clever and simple, but it held so much just beneath the surface. Details most people would chalk up to random spooky nonsense actually told the story of the missing children incident. What made this stick out for so many people was the mystery of it all. The fact that nothing is actually directly confirmed for the player. It was left to you to come to your own conclusions as to what happened and what it all meant. This spurred on a ton of discussion online as to exactly what the story of the game even was. And this only grew more and more active as the sequels came out. FNAF was not just a game, it was an ARG. It was a community effort to crack a code, to put disparate details together to form one coherent story. That sense of mystery, of community, drew in so many young fans and kept them enraptured for years. At least that's the TLDR. That's what everyone remembers, but I think sometimes people look back at FNAF with rose-tinted glasses nowadays. I think it's worth remembering that at a lot of points in the franchise's history, there was a lot of drama. FNAF 4, Sister Location, and God, FNAF World were extremely controversial games on their releases. A lot of people were frustrated with FNAF 4, how vague and incomprehensible its story was on release. When MatPat made his video and proposed Dream Theory, essentially admitting defeat on actually solving the game's story properly, much of the fanbase was in uproar. They didn't like the idea that the entire franchise was just a dream. Many people thought the theory was wrong and incomplete, but no one really had the answers to figure out what the correct theory was. In a later interview with Dawko, Scott himself even says he felt the franchise had stopped being a story at this point. It had gotten so bloated, so large and incomprehensible that the community was rightly frustrated that they couldn't actually put the story together with the clues that they had been given. FNAF World put even more fuel on this fire. With how, at least seemingly, aggressive the game was towards the fanbase, many people felt like Scott Cawthon was calling them out for wanting answers to the questions he himself had raised. I really don't think that this was ever Scott's intention, but with how this game plays out, I can forgive fans for feeling this way. Sister Location was a step in the right direction, to an extent, but it was controversial for its own reasons. The game felt too sci-fi, too fantastical. Not to mention that at this point, the plot was getting kind of impossible to believe. Now there's the scooper and a literal purple corpse walking around, and the bully who was Afton's son is back and hunting his father, and there's an entire underground facility under the Afton family home, apparently. It just felt like the series had jumped the shark, and the story still wasn't even over yet. We still needed answers. For everything Sister Location had made sense of, it had asked another 2 questions, and the fanbase was sick of it. It wasn't until Pizzeria Simulator, FNAF 6, that the franchise's reputation would turn around for the most part. This game, in Scott's own words, exists to wrangle a few plot points and put them in order. And you can really feel how this game is just forcing an ending to happen at point. Like, it just literally forced every major character who was still alive into one location and literally burned the entire franchise's story down to the ground. And it worked. Connection Terminated is a good ending to FNAF's story. It's thematically resonant and really cool when you're just watching it happen. But this game, and many of the FNAF games that came before it, were a course correction. Scott was able to read the room. He was able to see what his audience wanted and what they didn't want, and he responded to that. It seems like so many mascot horror games want to repeat what FNAF was and what it did without realizing why FNAF worked and what the good parts of FNAF were. FNAF drew players in with its novel and inventive gameplay. It gave them an experience that was worth caring about at first glance. It was people's passion for that experience that made them dig deeper and find more. One thing that's going to be very important for later is that you could absolutely play through every FNAF game without looking into things too deeply and come away with something at least approaching a story. FNAF 2 tells you about the murders and the hauntings of the MCI. FNAF 3 tells you, without doing anything in the bad ending, about how the purple guy went and killed the animatronics and how they got their revenge on him. FNAF 4 tells the story of a scared child and his older brother, and how his bullying went too far. sister location relays everything you need to know about the scooper and the animatronic's plans to escape without you doing any digging. The way Pizzeria Simulator is written, even if you don't know exactly who any of these characters are, you can at least kinda understand what's going on here and why it's so important. As long as you know about the murders of the children, about who the purple guy is and who Circus Baby and the puppet are at a basic level, which the other games will tell you, Connection Terminated will at least work. You understand that the player character and someone are making a sacrifice to let the cycle of revenge and hatred and haunting finally end. You do get a lot more out of the story if you look into things, but the basic gist of what's happening is still fine even if you don't. The fact that the game's worked on the most basic level, without looking up any YouTube videos or Reddit threads or doing any investigating, is why people wanted to look further. It's why they kept digging. To be absolutely 100% clear on this point, the fact that if you do some digging, there's interesting lore that has good storytelling in it does not redeem a product that does not tell a story at a base level. Now, with that all cleared up, I think we can move on to talking about Poppy Playtime's story and why it struggles to implement the same groundwork that FNAF had laid down. The story of Poppy Playtime isn't just bad, it's like fractally bad. Every single problem is recursive, all enhancing the awfulness of each other aspect. There's no one issue with like what actually happens in the story that everything else orbits around. It's a death by 1,000 cuts sort of thing, but every one of the cuts makes the other cuts bleed even more profusely. And considering the nature of the problem here, I'm not even really sure where to start with this criticism. It is very tempting to talk at length about all of the many issues I have with the game's story, why it doesn't work for me, why I think it's boring and annoying and silly, but all of that seems kind of pointless because I don't think it's the central issue. Some people will find parts of the story that I dislike intriguing, and at some level that's just a matter of personal taste. The problem, the thing that I think is actually worth discussing, is that the way that Poppy Playtime tells its story is objectively flawed, and flawed in a way that I think the fanbase doesn't understand. Okay, a good example of this is Lily Lovebraids from Chapter 5. Now, this character's story is actually really interesting. It starts with a character named Miss Gracie. She is a member of the staff responsible for brainwashing the toys, destroying their sense of self and convincing them that the terrible situation they're in is actually good for them. It's implied that during the Hour of Joy, she was captured and turned into Lily Lovebraids, who was then subjected to those same tapes that she created to brainwash the toys until she forgot who she was. Gracie, now transformed into Lily Lovebraids, was given her own corpse for safekeeping and trapped in a deep section of the factory by the prototype, isolated from everyone with her own dead body as company, stuck in a factory of her own making, suffering alone for eternity. That sounds like cool, right? Like, that is a good story at some level. And yeah, if you watch a YouTuber explain it to you like that, it does sound like a good story. But that's not what happens in the game. In the game, you find Gracie's tapes playing in one of the rooms as a bit of world building, and then you go to Sweet Street where Lily Lovebraids is, and she's like creepy or whatever. Then you find Gracie's corpse in her house, and then you escape and you kill Lily. That's it. There are some tapes and documents detailing more of what's happening here, but I'm pretty sure all of them are missable in this chapter. Again, I haven't played the chapter myself, and if I'm wrong about that, please do tell me in the comments. But from what I was able to see from watching other people's playthroughs and the bit of research I did besides that, I am pretty sure you can just miss most of the context for this. While Lily Lovebraids does have a full arc as a character that, if you are given all of the information, can be put together without too much trouble, the fact is that not every player will have the requisite information, which will make the entire encounter feel completely random. There is a narrative thrust here. We learn about what Gracie did in the past, and then we meet her and see what her final fate was. But that context, that story, can be entirely missed if you're not careful. This is just not how you should do storytelling in a video game. Fundamentally, playing a game normally should give you all of the necessary context to understand what is happening in the main story. Side content in a video game is, by its very nature, optional. Who is the prototype? If you don't get the tapes, you will have no idea besides the fact that he's big and evil and did the Hour of Joy. Actually, considering the fact that the Hour of Joy was ultimately probably a good thing since it stopped the continuation of the slaughter of thousands of orphans, he seems like mostly a good guy. I mean, apparently he kills a lot of people and runs the entire factory like a mob boss, but it's all very vague unless you find the tapes. But actually, it turns out that the prototype was actually Ollie, and that Ollie was real and apparently Poppy's adoptive brother, and that's his motivation in all of this? At least, that's what the YouTube videos I found online told me. There are just so many examples of this. Like, what's Doey's deal? He's like the kid who fell into that vat of acid or whatever and got turned into this thing by accident, right? Well, actually, that's only 1/3 of Doey's backstory. He's actually 3 kids that got smushed together, and that's why he sort of like talks to himself once at like the very end of the chapter in an extremely high stress situation. I had no idea that that's what was supposed to be going on when I watched that part of the chapter. I just thought he was being weird. A YouTuber had to tell me what Doey's actual backstory was. What's the doctor's deal? Why is he a computer? How is he related to all of the other messed up stuff going on in this factory? Also something I had to learn from a YouTuber. This is like if a Danganronpa game had a case where the only way to figure out who did the murder was to do their 3rd free time event and learn a certain detail about their past. That would be a shit mystery and a shit story if that's how they wrote the game. And honestly, that's how a lot of Poppy Playtime works. I want to stress that having side content that fills in more lore and backstory is not a bad thing. It's a good thing, actually. But that side content should be skippable. It should not be necessary to understand like the basic things that are happening in the story. If the side content isn't actually side content, if you have to trudge through all of it, or more likely, watch a YouTube video explaining it to you, then the story has failed. If someone says that they didn't like Lily Lovebraids and felt like she came out of nowhere, pointing to a bunch of easily missable details that tell you who she actually was does not counter that. If someone says that they aren't invested in the prototype and they don't understand why he's doing what he's doing, random tapes that they could miss aren't a counter to that criticism. The game should tell you these details if they're going to make them this integral to the story. This is why the story of Poppy Playtime is fundamentally bad, regardless of how many good ideas it has or how much potential there is. If a story requires paratext, like a YouTube video to explain it to you, it isn't a good story. And again, this is something we've seen happen in mascot horror before. FNAF got so bogged down in mystery and giving hints for the players to put together that most of the fanbase got tired of it. You can only jerk a fanbase around for so long, selling them on a mystery, feeding them clues and questions and no answers for so long before they realize that you're fucking with them. You can only end on so many cliffhangers before people stop getting excited to see what comes next and start getting annoyed that we're not getting the answers that we were promised. There's a video on YouTube that I think about a lot, and it only gets more and more relevant to me as time goes on. H-Bomber Guy's Sherlock is garbage and here's why was a huge wake-up call for me as a young teenager, because it helped me understand a pattern that had kept happening with me and certain pieces of media, Sherlock itself being one of them. If you haven't seen this video already, I highly recommend you go watch it, but I'll summarize the relevant points here for anyone who doesn't want to go do that. It is pretty long. So, I stopped watching Sherlock after season 2, which ended with a cliffhanger where Sherlock has to jump off of a high building to win one of Moriarty's games, or Watson will be killed, I'm pretty sure was the thing, and he makes that sacrifice for his friend. But then, at the end of the episode, it reveals that he somehow survived. In the wait for season 3, the only question on the entire fanbase's mind was how. How did Sherlock pull it off? How did he fall from that high up, convince Moriarty's men that he had died while surviving anyway? It was tantalizing. It was a great mystery. The following season of Sherlock then makes fun of the fanbase for wanting an answer to that question and says that you shouldn't care how he survived, you should only care why he did it. When I heard that they were not going to answer the big mystery cliffhanger at the end of the season, I just dropped the show. It didn't help that I had very recently watched Death Note, which has a scene with a very similar premise and a super fun, wacky plan enacted by the, well, heroes, I guess you could call them, to save the day at the last second. Up until that realization that they just weren't going to live up to the promise they made in season 2, I thought that the show was so clever. I thought it was so smart and interesting, and I couldn't wait to see where everything was going to lead. But seeing through that one part of the lie made the entire illusion fall apart. I started seeing how often the show hand-waved other mysteries, how often Sherlock's deductions were based on faulty reasoning or something completely made up or just wrong, and the entire show went from feeling so epic and meaningful to feeling like a wet fart. This is an experience that I've had with a lot of other shows, Star vs. the Forces of Evil being another one. The end of season 1 of that show sets up a story that's like so cool, and it feels like it's setting up for something so big that will suddenly make everything in the story make sense, only for that reveal to basically never actually come, for the final twist to be underwhelming and way less meaningful than I and the rest of the fanbase thought it was going to be. What I learned from that experience, one of the big takeaways that I think you should take from that H-Bomber Guy video and the entire Sherlock situation, is that it is incredibly easy for a story to make promises and very difficult for a story to keep those promises. But at the end of the day, it's only the kept promises that matter. One of the things I look for in a show or comic or whatever now is signs that it's actually going somewhere, that it feels like there's a plan, like the story has a real conclusion in mind. Because I just don't want to waste my time getting so invested in a story again, only to realize that I was being lied to. This is what I think is happening with Poppy Playtime, among a lot of other issues piling up. The game has been making so many big promises, writing so many huge checks it can't actually cash. And people who've seen this before, people who've been paying attention to how this goes, are starting to see that the game's story is a house of cards. It very much feels like we're headed for another Sherlock situation with Poppy Playtime. It feels like we're at the same point FNAF was before Pizzeria Simulator, where we're focused so much on building up mystery and hype that we've lost sight of what's actually important in a story. And the thing that interests me the most, the thing that I worry about the most, is that it feels like this kind of thing is only happening more and more recently, even when the material in question isn't pushing people in this direction. I've been around the internet for a long time. I kinda grew up with fandom, reading fanfic, talking about AUs and theories and whatnot for my favorite shows and video games. I've learned the language of the internet, and more importantly, of fandom spaces in particular. And honestly, I love it. I love the passion that people have for these games and movies and shows. I love the fan works and the fan discussions, and I love being a part of this ecosystem now as a YouTuber. But I've also been around long enough to know that there's a bad side to all of this. And not just the stuff that everyone knows about. The crazies who dox people or try to assault or even kill people over fandom drama. No, I've noticed a much subtler issue. The way that fandom can contort and mutilate a story into something unrecognizable, and the damage that that can do to the understanding of a piece of art. One of the most recent high-profile victims of this is the Amazing Digital Circus. And no, I'm not talking about the drama with people harassing Gooseworks and all of that. That's bad and it's a problem, but it's one that we all recognize and we know what the solution to it is. I'm talking about the way that fans talk about the show and how so many of them seem to completely miss the point. In my online discussions, I've seen a ton of people put so much effort into TADC theories, into trying to solve the mystery of the circus, why they're here, what's happening, Soma theory and everything else surrounding it, and many of the people I know personally who talk about the show immediately brought up these ideas whenever a new episode was dropped. It was the first thing that they looked for in each episode, which was so weird to me. Because by episode 8 especially, I think it's really clear that we're not going to get any answers to most of these questions. Thematically, TADC is a character drama with psychological horror elements. It's about being stuck in a situation that you don't understand, that you have no hope of escaping from, and finding a way to be okay with that. The characters, and by extension, the audience, learning the truth of this place would only weaken that message. Early on, I was unsure what road the series would go down, if it would have the characters escape, or if they would be trapped here forever. But after episode 7, I was very sure that the themes would be pushing towards acceptance and being okay with not knowing, rather than being about solving this giant mystery. Someone else here on YouTube has already made a great video about this. Growwidge's Failing to Absorb a Narrative is a good video and I'll link it below. In that video, he discusses how people still try to get theories out of episode 7, how they still try to use it to solve the big mystery of the series, not realizing that it was pretty much directly telling them that there was no big mystery to solve. That video is a great examination of the issue and explaining why looking at a story this way is bad for a single person, but there was something that it didn't try to cover. Why? Why is it like this? Why are people trying so hard to figure out the mystery in a show that doesn't have one? I think that the answer is actually pretty simple, because this is the only method of media analysis that they know. For a lot of young kids on the internet, their formative experiences with media were defined by FNAF, and more importantly, by game theory. For a lot of people, MatPat was their English teacher. He taught them how to analyze media and understand what it was really saying beneath the hood. And I love MatPat, and I mean no hate towards him by saying this, but this is very much not a good thing. MatPat's videos, as good as they are just not good media analysis. They're wild, off-the-wall, sensationalist theories that give meaning to meaningless details and often avoid very simple, pertinent information if it doesn't further the theory. The point was never media analysis. The point was to be fun, to present a case for an idea, and to try to let you, the audience, if only for the runtime of a single video, see a game in a different light. It was not about being a fair and rational analysis of the media at hand. The theories ignored a lot of very important things like authorial intent and thematic relevance. They just looked for the biggest, most entertaining pitch that they could create for that game. And to be super clear, there's nothing wrong with making videos like that as long as the audience understands that that is what the video is. Unfortunately, much of MatPat's audience was young and impressionable, and also a lot of them probably didn't pay very much attention in English class, so they took a lot of the wrong messages away from his videos. Many of these kids were taught to read media not as a story, but as a mystery to be solved. And as the adage goes, when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Everything is a mystery that has to be pieced together. Everything is a part of the puzzle. And that puzzle isn't solved by, playing the game or reading the material. What are you, stupid? No, that puzzle is solved in YouTube videos, by talking in forums and Discord servers, by participating in fandom, not by engaging with the material. I think a lot of the mascot horror community has this warped understanding of how to engage with the genre, and sometimes with media in general. To them, it's okay if the game's story doesn't make sense on a first playthrough, as long as the answers are still out there somewhere. As long as there's passion in the project. As long as they're able to convince themselves that digging deeper and looking further is worth it, then the game can't be bad. But at the end of the day, this outlook is only setting them up for disappointment. Look, if you like Poppy Playtime, cool, I get that. I understand liking theorizing about a world and making a use and being really passionate about a group of characters. I mean, hell, I'm a Sonic fan. But please understand me when I tell you that you deserve better. You deserve a story that makes sense on the first playthrough. You deserve a game that prioritizes your time and gives its all in making an entertaining experience. You deserve answers, not a series of constantly dangling threads meant to hold you along just long enough to pump out another sequel. Poppy Playtime, for as much as I dislike it, does have things in it that I think are legitimately good. The character designs are pretty neat, some of the horror segments are good, the story has something there if it could just find the right direction. But just because something is good at points or has some good elements, that does not mean that the work itself is holistically good. You deserve better than that. I mean it. Alright, that's the end of the video. This is a bit different from what I normally do. I kind of want to branch out a little bit from just talking about Sonic. I'm still going to make Sonic videos, but I want to talk about some other stuff as well. If you're still watching this, there's a good chance that you really enjoyed the content, and if you did, consider liking, commenting, subscribing, all that good stuff, and if you really love what I do, consider becoming a member to help support the channel. Members get access to every video a full day early, and they get a shout out at the end of every single video. Speaking of, big shoutouts to Elric111, Agent B7, Joseph Florian, GB484, Atria5506, Nicholas Goslin, Noble_Samurai, Catmat, Bladed Fox 14, Shredding Pixels, and RoboNerd6925.